I'm Victor Polino.
And I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And you're listening to Civil Dissonance,
a show where we explore, engage, and dissect the topics that divide us as a society. Today on Civil Dissonance, we'll be discussing
liberalism in America. You know, Chris, I think we got some confusion going on here.
Okay.
Well, you know, we often talk about conservatives and liberals, the different parties and philosophies and things, but we use them interchangeably. I kind of worry that we're not using it in the right context.
Yeah, you mean we use liberal and Democrat and conservative and Republican interchangeably?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I worry that, to our listeners, to ourselves, that we might not be getting it right.
Yeah, I worry about that sometimes too.
I mean, I think maybe we have some of our own biases that we bring to it. And, you know, obviously there's a media slant when you watch the media, and they have a slant. And I think we sort of have this notion in our head of what the different philosophies are, you know, liberalism and conservatism. So I think maybe we need to do an episode where we break that down.
Yeah, definitely.
So we'll do liberalism this time. I think might be a good place to start.
Well, that is the episode we're doing today, Victor.
So with that in mind, what do you think the media portrayal or the outside portrayal of liberalism is?
We hear the term or the phrase liberal media a lot. And we did the episode with Frankie on the Fairness Doctrine, and she talked about, you know, the liberal media. And usually when I hear people talk about the liberal media, I hear MSNBC or CNN. And then on the other side, when I hear people talk about the conservative media, I hear, you know, Breitbart and Fox News.
Yeah. And, you know, if you watch one of those news sources that has your bias or it doesn't have your bias, I think maybe oftentimes, at least when I watch them, I sort of feel like maybe they're just attacking the other side without fully understanding the philosophy.
No, yeah, I completely agree with that.
I wonder if philosophy is even the right term to use. I mean, what ideology? What term would you use in there?
Ideology sounds safe to me. Way of thinking, which I think is what ideology or philosophy means.
Yeah. Well, and with that, you know, I often wonder, what is liberalism? You know, what's liberalism through the eyes of a conservative? What's liberalism through the eyes of a liberal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And according to where you go on the internet, you're going to get completely different answers.
When I think of liberalism, I typically think of people who believe that government is there to protect everyone, and you sort of have to get more involved. Government has to be more involved. That's sort of my interpretation of liberalism.
Okay. So what's your interpretation of conservatism?
My interpretation of conservatism is usually people who believe that government should have minimal involvement in your life. I think that's a safe interpretation. At least that's my interpretation. Now, of course, you have the religious aspects of beliefs and things like that, and how they want it to be involved on both sides. You have, you know, fiscal responsibilities and I think those all tie in. It's just how much regulation you want in your day, should I say? What do you think?
In looking into this, when we first started talking about this, you know, I asked myself that question. You know, what is liberalism? What is conservatism? And of course, you take to the place where all the information lies, the internet.
Oh, the dangerous internet.
Which, whenever using the internet, you have to be very aware of where you're getting your information. You should also verify that information is coming from a reliable source, which, you know, I guess is being aware of where you're getting your information. But you also want to make sure that there's no bias in the information you're getting. And if there is a bias, understand that there's a bias.
And then try to look for a counter to it.
Yeah. So I looked it up on, you know, Webster's Dictionary. I think that's pretty safe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
Unless you hate words. I mean.
In Webster's Dictionary, they define liberalism as it pertains to political mindset or political philosophy. The first two words, a political philosophy based on belief in progress, the essential goodness of the human race and the autonomy of the individual, and standing for protection and political and civil liberties. Specifically, such a philosophy that considers government as a crucial instrument for amelioration of social inequities, such as those involving race, gender, or class. And for conservatism, as it deals with a political philosophy. It's a political philosophy based on tradition and social stability, stressing established institutions and preferring gradual development to abrupt change. Specifically, such a philosophy calling for lower taxes, limited government regulation of business and investing, a strong national defense, and individual financial responsibility for personal needs such as retirement income or health care coverage. So that's the definitions.
That's interesting. I'm still stuck on the word amelioration myself. I can't even say that word. So I guess I kind of had it right.
Yeah.
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 I mean, one sort of deals with trying to instill the rights of the people through using government, and the other one is trying to, I guess they sort of believe that it's already there, and you should fight to just maintain that.
Okay.
Does that sound right?
It's basically what I gathered from Merriam-Webster.
Yeah. Thank goodness for the dictionary.
Well, perhaps, possibly, maybe, we should ask somebody who knows more about this than we do.
Yeah, that might be a good thing to do.
Yeah. So it's my turn, Victor.
All right, you go find us a guest.
I am going to go find us a guest, and we'll be right back with that guest. On today's episode, we'll be speaking with Dr. Eric Alterman. He is a distinguished professor of English and journalism at Brooklyn College and the City University of New York Graduate School of Journalism. He's also the liberal media columnist for The Nation, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, the Nation Institute, and the World Policy Institute. Dr. Alterman has authored 10 books, which include The Cause, The Fight for American Liberalism, from Franklin Roosevelt to Barack Obama, Why We're Liberals, a handbook for restoring America's most liberal ideals, and most recently, Inequality in One City, Bill de Blasio and the New York Experiment, Year 1. Welcome, Dr. Alterman.
Thank you.
Aside from everything I've mentioned, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
A little bit more about myself. Okay. I've had 2 careers simultaneously, actually 3. One as an academic, one as a journalist, although my journalism doesn't really involve typical calling up people and getting information, and working in think tanks. And I've done all 3 of those things ever since I graduated from college in 1982. I grew up in New York. I live in New York. I'm a New Yorker. I'm a Jew. I'm kind of a cliche. I'm an Upper West Side New York Jewish intellectual.
Can you explain to us what is liberalism?
Well, the problem with that question, I knew that was going to be your first question. The problem with it is that it's a word that has had different meanings over time. And you can't really understand it without knowing its history. Originally, what's called classical liberalism was a reaction against the crown. It's the philosophy that the United States government was founded on in the 1700s. And classical liberalism looks a lot like conservatism looked like until recently, until it was taken over by crazy people. Classical liberalism sees the big break in history of thought that classical liberalism brought along was to see people as individuals and having autonomy over their own selves. And the idea that people, rather than God or royalty or people of property, could decide for themselves how they wanted to organize their states, their lives, their counties, their villages, and go ahead and do it. This was a revolutionary idea back in the 1700s. And that was the idea of classical liberalism, that people were responsible for themselves. And that associations ought to be voluntary rather than imposed from above. And the problem with that is that it didn't account for concentrations of power that made those ideas impossible to execute. That big corporations grew in the United States and England and elsewhere. Other forms of monopoly came up. The church was very powerful. The military grew, although that took a while. And the idea that everyone could be responsible for themselves and have an equal chance to succeed in life wasn't really the case. It obviously wasn't the case for slaves. So classical liberalism lasted until the 1930s, really. It began to change a bit in the early part of the century under what we call the progressive era. But it fundamentally changed in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal, when he said the only way for the little guy, the common man, to get a fair deal is to have strong institutions on his side and her side to fight the institutions that are preventing little people from getting a fair shake. And that institution was the government. So the government, which was seen previously as a necessary evil, as I said, this sounds like conservatism until recently, and something that was to be feared because it could get in the way of exercising one's freedom, it became the engine of assuring everybody a fair shake, of improving people's lives, of giving people equality of opportunity. And that's what liberalism is really all about. It's about providing people with the means to self-actualize, to achieve their goals, to be who they want to be without any interference. Liberalism is actually agnostic about how you do that. Government is the obvious way to do it, but if there's a better way to do it than government, then liberalism is all for that. Liberalism is okay with taxing people to provide services that everybody needs and to make a more equal society. But if there's a better way to do it than taxes, that's fine too. There's nothing about liberalism that is particularly pro-government or pro-taxes. It's just that those are the means by which these goals appear to be achievable or have been in the past.
So something that I've heard a lot is the term progressive. And I know from my readings on the internet, there are progressive liberals and there are progressive conservatives. You don't really hear a lot more, or you don't see a lot about the progressive conservative side. But can you speak to us a little bit about what a progressive liberal is?
Progressive is a different word than liberal. I think progressive is the opposite of conservative. I don't know of any progressive conservatives. There's a lot of overlap between progressives and liberals. The reason that you hear progressives rather than liberal of late is that the word liberal has been so stigmatized by conservatives as a terrible thing, as people who don't like patriotism, don't like the family, won't fight for their country, that liberals have run away from the label and embraced the label progressive. Originally, progressive has had two meanings, historically speaking, until recently. The first one was the progressive movement that began in the 1890s in the Middle West and then moved to the cities. And that was the idea that the corruption of the post-Civil War period, where the robber barons ran everything and the politicians worked for people like Rockefeller and Frick and Ford, that could be addressed by government and labor institutions. So that began in the 1890s, and that morphed into New Deal liberalism. I didn't give it proper credit when I answered the first question. Then it took on a second meaning in the New Deal because there was a split between liberals and progressives, where liberals were anti-communist and progressives were not. Progressives were sympathetic to communism, and many socialists called themselves progressives, and so did many communists. Now, during World War II, there was something called the Popular Front, because we were on the side of Russia, and Russia's obviously communist, Soviet Union, and so this distinction was glided over, and people didn't pay that much attention to it. But beginning in the 1950s, when communism became a big issue, there was a big split, and progressives were the ones who were saying, we should find a way to get along with the Soviets and maybe adopt some of their means. And liberals were saying, no, they're terrible. They hate freedom. We've got nothing in common with them. And we need to reform our own system, but not move in that direction. Now, recently, as I said, the word liberal, conservatives have invested so much money in demonizing the word liberal that people who would otherwise consider themselves liberal use the word progressive. Because progressive is a good word in America, because Americans like progress. And conservatives also try and use that word for the same reason. But if you ask me, was a progressive conservative, I would say it's a contradiction in terms. I don't know any progressive conservative.
It's interesting that you mentioned the time period of the 50s, between the 30s and the 50s. That was McCarthyism, wasn't it? Or
yes.
The rise of McCarthyism. Yeah,
liberals did a terrible job of defending their beliefs during the McCarthy era because they were so afraid of being associated with communists. And the country was in such a froth over fear of communism that very few liberals stood up for the Constitution and for their own beliefs. But there's no question that liberals demonstrated that they were anti-communist in that period. I think they went too far. I don't think there was any real communist. In fact, I'm sure there was no communist threat within the United States. There was never any possibility that the communists were going to take over even a school district in the United States. It's almost perfectly synonymous with the threat of Sharia law today. There isn't anywhere that's going to have Sharia law in the United States. It's nonsense. But liberals were so afraid of being tarred with this brush that they failed to stand up for their own side, and they gave in to a lot of curbs on constitutional freedoms, and also pursued a very aggressive foreign policy, anti-communist foreign policy that ended up in Vietnam, and it was a catastrophe for liberalism in the country.
Would our founders be considered liberals?
Well, yeah, they were liberals. They were classical liberals. And their liberalism has important legacies today. For one thing, almost all of the founders believed in the separation of church and state. They believed in it for different reasons than we do today. Many of them believed in it because they wanted to protect the church. But the idea that you should govern, that the evangelicals should be able to make policy through the government was anathema to them. Most, if not all of the founders, not all, but most of them were what are called deists. A deist is someone who believes that God was a clockmaker and made a clock to run by itself and then stepped back and played no role in society. Thomas Jefferson actually went to the trouble of rewriting the entire Bible, taking out every reference to God's supernatural power, because that's what he believed in. He believed in the Bible without a supernatural God. And this was not unusual. He wasn't doing anything risky at the time. And so the idea that people could be responsible for themselves, could choose their own form of government, that public virtue was something to be encouraged by government but not imposed by government, and that there should be no specific role for any established church. That was the liberalism of the founders that remains with us today.
That being said, what's the difference between the mindset of the classical liberal and the modern liberal?
The classical liberal believes that the marketplace will take care of all problems. Adam Smith is the ideal classical liberal, that there should be no interference with the marketplace, that the hidden hand of the market is the best solution to everything. Whereas the modern liberal believes that that's not the case, that there's all kinds of distortions in our system, and that the little guy needs protection. In fact, the common man needs protection against unfair monopolies and combinations and conspiracies, etc. And so the government needs to step in and make sure that everyone has the same equality of opportunity. I mean, obviously, in our society, there's no question that we don't have equality of opportunity. 20% of American children are born go hungry. 40% experience food insecurity at some point in their life. Those people are not born equal to people who don't have that experience, much less people like our current president, who was, born into a multimillionaire.
So I've read in some places, and this is in reference to party politics, but I've read in some articles that Republicans used to be liberals and Democrats were more of the conservatives, and at some point there was a switch.
Well, the terms themselves have gone through changes, so it's hard to, depends what period you're talking about. It used to be that each party had a liberal and a conservative wing. Southerners were conservative and Democrats. Northern Democrats were liberal. Same with the Republican Party. There weren't any Republican Democrats after the Civil War for a very long time. And Midwestern Republicans were conservative, and Northeastern Republicans were liberal. Nelson Rockefeller, who was vice president under Nixon and governor of New York, was extremely liberal. And what makes things even more confusing is that the conservatives took positions that are today considered liberal. So conservatives didn't want to spend any money on the military in the up through the 1960s, really, 1970s. They were willing to when they saw a threat of war, but they wanted to avoid the threat of war. So the liberals, like Harry Truman, were much more militant and sympathetic to military spending than their opponents were in, say, the election of 1948. And certainly Franklin Roosevelt was much more interested in building up the military because he saw the threat of Nazi Germany than his opponents were in the 1930s and 40s. So what ended Southern conservative Democrats was Lyndon Johnson's decision to sign the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill. Southern Democrats were racist, and they did not want to give black people the right to vote or many other rights. They didn't want any federal government interference in their way of life. The man who was the leader of them, Strom Thurmond, he broke off from the Democratic Party in 1948 over an anti-lynching law, which he said was an impingement on a federal government on states' rights, but it also was an anti-lynching law. And when Johnson decided to go full bore on civil rights, he said, "I've just lost the South for the Democrats for a generation." And he actually was underestimating how long he'd lost the South for the Democrats, because they're still gone. And that was back in 1964 and 65.
Can you explain to us what the difference between liberalism and conservatism is?
Well, it's easier to describe conservatism than liberalism. Conservatism has a few beliefs that are clear and relatively unchanging. Conservatism believes in small government. It believes in, it supports, conservatism historically, like I said, you have to talk about it somewhat historically. Today, it's easy just to say what conservatism is, and then I could point out that our current president is not a conservative in at least in philosophy. He might be one for pragmatic reasons. It believes in small government, it believes in a strong military, and it believes in supporting the church. So historically, conservatism has always liked the church, because the church is one of those institutions that keeps society on an even keel and doesn't involve the government. So that's always been before there was the United States, there was a conservatism that was allied with the church. Conservatives like small government because they think all bureaucracies are evil. All bureaucracies tend towards the destruction of personal freedom, and government is among the worst because it can take away your personal freedom. The founders believe that too, by the way. That's part of classical liberalism. And they believe there's been a battle since the end of the Cold War about the role of the military. Because, like I said, before the Cold War, the conservatives were isolationist and didn't like spending money on the military. They thought it was wasteful, and they thought there was dangers in letting the military get too strong. But the Cold War, during the Cold War, they flipped on that, and right after the Cold War, some of them were going back in that direction. Pat Buchanan was. But then when the War on Terror began, they found a new cause to appreciate military spending and wars and stuff. So the neoconservatives took over the conservative movement with regard to foreign policy, and they strongly believed in the use of military power to solve virtually all problems. And then if if you look at it from a pragmatic standpoint, you say, what is the conservative movement made up of? Who are its followers? It's people who don't like taxes, people who are committed to government support of the church, like the evangelicals, and also a very important component is people who believe that the Second Amendment should prevent the government from having any control over ownership of guns.
Do you think that people's misunderstanding of these terms, conservatism, liberalism, and the way they're probably misused in the media and in everyday conversation, do you think that hurts both causes?
I think it helps conservatism and hurts liberalism. It hurts liberalism because I think most people have views that fall into the liberal category, but because the word has been so demonized, they don't want to call themselves liberals. So if you look at what people's views are on guns, on birth control, on taxes, on the role of the government in helping people, on schools, they all have what falls into the liberal category. But they don't want to call themselves liberals because liberals have been treated as if it's some kind of disease. So they want to call that centrist. And it is centrist, but it's part of liberalism, and it prevents people from embracing those positions. Conservatives, on the other hand, are not, and in America, they're not really very conservative. The American conservative believes things that very few people believe outside of the United States. Like in America, to be conservative is to deny global warming. There's no other party, major party in the entire world that denies the reality of man-made global warming except the United States Republican Party. So to be anti-science today is to be conservative, but there's nothing conservative about that. Again, back in the 1970s, conservatism in the United States was taken over by people who are much more revolutionaries than they are conservatives. They don't want to conserve so much as they want to overthrow the current order. They want to push back civil rights. They want to make the country less equal. You saw that in the tax bill. The tax bill that these conservatives passed is making the country much more unequal, even though inequality, I would argue, is the single biggest problem we have. So I would say that if you look at England, you have a conservative party and a liberal party. In the United States, we have a centrist party and a reactionary party. We don't have a conservative party. Haven't had one since the 1970s.
And which would be the centrist party and the reactionary party?
The Democrats are the centrist party. I would say the Democrats are more conservative than the Republican Party because the Democrats are trying to conserve a lot of the programs and mores that we've had in the past, but the Republicans are trying to overthrow them. They're a revolutionary party, not a conservative party.
You said something about all of this demonization of the term liberalism kind of kicking off in the 70s, wasn't it?
Yes, there was enormous investment. Many, many hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by conservative billionaires and conservative institutions to demonize liberalism. They felt that they had been demonized by the liberals. They had a point. And they managed to overturn that over a period of 30 or 40 years very successfully. Presidents used to say they were proud to be a liberal. The last president to say that out loud was John Kennedy. The last Democratic candidate to call himself a liberal was George McGovern in 1972. Hillary Clinton never said she was a liberal. Bill Clinton never said he was a liberal. Barack Obama never said he was a liberal. They were all afraid to use the term.
Wow. I guess final question. We're getting close to the end of our time. I don't want to take any more of your time, but is there anything that you feel that our listeners should know about liberalism that I haven't asked or that we haven't covered?
Well, I just think that you shouldn't allow people to be defined by what their enemies say about them. You know, it's interesting. Socialism has become a much more popular term among young people now. It's just as popular among young people as the word capitalism is. And liberalism is too. I think more young people call themselves liberals than they do conservatives today. So I think that the demonization of liberals that period is kind of ending now. Trump has ushered in an entirely new era of our politics. The biggest problem that liberals face from a political standpoint, I would say, there's two problems. One is that money is the most important determinant of our politics, not people. The political system runs on money, and the Supreme Court has ruled that you're not allowed to that you're not allowed to regulate that in any meaningful way. And the second problem is that there's a combination of the fact that liberals all live in bunched up places like where I live in New York City. In my neighborhood, you'd never find a Trump voter anywhere. And we have, in New York, we have a fraction of the representation that people who live in underpopulated places like Wyoming, say, do. We both have 2 senators, and yet we have 40 times as many people. Same with California. And the way that gerrymandering is drawn up, we're further weakened. So it's quite possible that Democratic Party is going to get 70% of the vote in the future and only 40% of the representatives because of the way our government is set up. So just because the country has a conservative government, which it does now, if you want to call Trump a conservative, doesn't mean the country is conservative. Trump lost the popular election by 3 million votes, and more people voted for Democrats in Congress than they did for Republicans, even though Republicans control both houses, because of the fact that we have an extremely outdated political system, which might have made sense in 1789, but doesn't make any sense today.
When you say outdated political system, what do you mean by that?
I mean that the system which was created for a society, a rural society without, cars and electricity and internet, etc., it has been allowed to be manipulated to the point where people are fundamentally unrepresented in the most meaningful ways. And that's why other countries have proportional representation in most ways, and parliamentary governments, and we have a system which does not represent people. I mean, look, in our election, it's only the purple states that matter. The election only takes place among about 14 states. The other states, presidential candidates can ignore. Whereas in other countries, everybody's vote matters because it's not divided up on the basis of these irrational maps that derive from states, where, as I said, Wyoming and Alaska get 50 times the representation in the United States Senate that New York and California get. And number 2, by allowing the politicians themselves to draw up districts that look ridiculous in order to protect their own jobs. So I would say our system is operating beyond the level of what you could call an actual democracy anymore. And I would urge people to look into that, because we can't fix our problems without fixing the system.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have. So, Dr. Alterman, I really appreciate you being on the show today and taking your time to speak with us and to explain to our listeners about liberalism in the United States.
My pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
All right. So that was Eric Alterman, and we're going to take a short break, and Victor and I will be right back with our wrap-up.
If you like what you hear, you can help us out by funding our efforts in keeping our show ad-free.
You can do that by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance, or by following the link on our website and in our show notes.
You can also show support to our guests by purchasing their books and other works. You can find the list with links on our website under Guest Works.
Well, Victor, that was Eric Alterman talking to us about liberalism in America. So what are your thoughts?
I have to say, it's no wonder why we're all so confused and standoffish and lost right now when it comes to parties and getting along and ideologies of liberalism and conservatism. They just crisscross so much throughout history and branched off and overlap. I mean, I can see why we're so confused.
I thought it interesting that he said that classical liberalism kind of looks like what conservatism used to be until just recently.
He referred to it as autonomy over ourselves.
Yeah, autonomy over our own lives. So we decide how our government's set up and we as the people decide what laws are going to govern us. And he starts talking about the robber barons and the progressive movement. So at one point, we allowed the crown to be replaced with big business and religious movements. So going back to, or what he says, the idea of classical liberalism is, which is what our country was founded on, having autonomy over our own lives, not letting people of wealth or royalty or God determine how we run and live our lives. We kind of backtracked a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole point of our Constitution is the idea that we rule ourselves. I think we've established that throughout many of our other episodes.
Yeah.
And when big business and these religious movements started taking over and in trying to inject themselves into government, we were losing what it was to have the Constitution, that each and every one of us is equal and has an equal opportunity.
We allowed for these institutions to have influence over our representatives who were defining the laws in which we were to follow.
So it seems like we've got some lobbying going on here again.
By people of influence.
By people of influence, yes. And I think this is where we see a major split in the philosophy. I think, where we had this conservative philosophy that's still today, where you had government is a necessary evil to preserve our rights. Now liberals began to change from that to we have to have government influence to combat this big business, outside influence. Yeah,
these influential organizations trying to inject their ideas and philosophies into everybody's lives.
That's exactly what I wanted to say.
And it wasn't just... I know he said that, conservatism until recently looked like classical liberalism then, but he discusses the use of government and taxes by liberals as a means to achieve the lessening of social and economic inequalities.
Yeah, and one of the things that he said was that liberals today and overall were agnostic about how to do that. And I love that phrase because to me that shows there is an area where conservatives and liberals could come together, because it's not... I don't think liberals just want to use big government, but it's the only thing they see right now as the answer.
It's a tool.
It's a tool. And I think that will help establish what he talked about was the quality of opportunity.
Yeah.
And then, he gave us some statistics, which I thought were alarming, which was that 20% of children go hungry in the United States, and there's 40% have food insecurity. I mean, that's alarming to me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I guess I never really thought of it as that high.
It is a thing, and it's not something that a lot of people want to think about. It makes them feel uneasy to think that children are going hungry in America, or that even the food insecurities is a thing, not knowing where you're going to get your next meal from.
Yeah. And, I could see why liberals would want to have, more involvement from government to guarantee that.
One of the things that he said that I didn't realize, and I'm glad he said it because it really makes me think. He was talking about how there were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats.
Yeah. Well, that was what I meant with the part of that crisscrossing all over the place, and how in the South we had the Southern Democrats and
they were conservative.
And they were conservative, but, they supported racism and
yeah, and that's what he said, that the Southern Democrats left the Democratic Party after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act.
And then they couldn't get them back, even today.
No. But that to me is very interesting. We're so polarized today that again, we use Democrat and liberal and Republican and conservative interchangeably, but at one point that wasn't a thing.
No. There were so many different segments of each bound together by location. The South had one philosophy, the North had one philosophy, the Midwest, I think is what he said, also had was it conservative?
I believe he said the Midwest Republicans were conservative.
But even in those smaller those sections, you still had branches where they were still separate. So Republican, conservative, Democratic, conservative, however you want to say that.
So it was the late 60s, or it was in the 60s that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act was signed. By Lyndon Johnson. And then starting in the 70s is when he said the campaign to demonize the term liberal started.
Yeah.
That's interesting to note.
Yeah. Once again, propaganda is kind of rearing its head.
Yeah. Spending, he said, millions of dollars in a campaign to demonize this term that was used by both parties.
I know, once again, it's how we use our tools and how things are getting misrepresented. Not focusing on the commonalities. He also said that one of the solutions for some of the things is that we shouldn't let ourselves be defined by our enemies.
I think that goes for conservatives and liberals alike, and pretty much anybody. We shouldn't let our enemies define us. I mean, if we did that as just America and we let ISIS define us, then, that'd be a pretty horrible definition, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't think that would be a very fair assessment of what the United States truly represents.
Yeah.
Or its people represent, I guess.
Now, he did mention something that I am glad that we had even the smallest bit of time to talk about, and I can't wait to do an episode completely and utterly on this. Well, a couple episodes, because you're going to get multiple views, but McCarthyism, Victor.
Oh my goodness, here he goes again. Okay, get it out.
I have been waiting to even broach McCarthyism. I find it a very interesting time in our American political history. Yeah, just the fact that we got to mention that really made me smile. Chris,
when we talk about my obsession with how Flat Earth Society doesn't truly exist, that's Chris's thing, as he is obsessed with McCarthyism.
Not obsessed, it's just very interesting.
Obsessed.
Anyway, so going back to what he was talking about with
progressives.
Yeah, he did talk about progressives a little bit, and how because of the demonization of the term liberal, those that would be considered liberals are now using the term progressive to talk about themselves.
And how, because of the McCarthy era and the liberals trying to distance themselves progressives, they stopped speaking up when they probably should have.
Yeah, and it was out of fear.
Yeah.
I have no doubt. It was a very intimidating time for anybody that may have had even a slight difference in opinion from those that were doing the things that happened during the McCarthy era.
One of the things I agree with as far as like classical liberalism, and because, at that point, it was, the founding fathers and their philosophies, is that you should question your government. And the problem with McCarthyism is it really kind of stems you into not questioning things.
Yeah, you really couldn't.
So, I mean, as far as liberalism goes, that became they didn't want a dirty name because of that.
Didn't want to be associated with the progressives at that time.
Yeah. It's important to understand that this is just one side of a multi-sided issue. And we want to add to this episode that we are going to do a conservative episode.
Conservatism in America coming up.
Yeah, conservatism in America. And because we want to have a balanced perspective on this.
Yes.
And we want to present both sides, and that's imperative. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and I'm extremely interested. I learned a lot from this episode that I really didn't know, and it's I think it's because it's just not talked about. I want to say that when we have our episode with conservatism, I'm going to have the same experience.
Yeah, I think it'll be an equally enlightening experience.
We have this, the polarization that we have in our country right now. It's hard to have that discussion because everybody's attacking everybody else. So it's hard to, ask a person who might have liberal ideals about conservatism without them getting angry and upset, and vice versa. Ask somebody who has conservative ideals about liberalism and they just get angry.
And it doesn't help that we have, propaganda campaigns blurring the lines for us.
Yeah, doesn't help either. Not at all. We'd like to give a special thanks to Stu Art and Design for our show's logo, and to Kiko's Last Smile for the music you've heard during the show.
We would also like to thank our guests for their time and insight, and a thank you to our listeners. Without you, this isn't possible.
Show your support by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance, And head over to our website for a full listing of our episodes, transcripts, and more information about our guests and other supporters.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media like Instagram. Links are in the show notes and on the website.
And if you're so inclined, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you like what you've heard, tell people about us.
I'm Victor Polino.
And I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And you've been listening to Civil Dissonance, a Pro Thoughts production.
Now go out and start a conversation.
I like it.
I like it too.